They issued a CB scheme document, which CB scheme Luke actually talked about a little bit in his 10 worst things about 601, which I agree with most of what he said actually. Because 601 is written like a piece of junk. It's very confusing and interlaced and about 400-ish pages long at this point.
If you can, keep your mouth close to the mic. Your sound is coming in and out as you move.
Yeah, that's better.
Thank you.
That's my laptop. There's my mic.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So CB Scheme issued a document about risk management. Actually, no, this document is about the test certificates related to all the collateral standards, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes on a slide in probably 4 or 5 slides from now. So the collateral standards are the adjoining standards to the, let me go to the next slide, 60601-1. What I call the, well, most people call the general standard right here, general requirements for basic safety and essential performance, which is the standard that is sort of the cornerstone of the whole series. Everything points back to this standard. And this is what's the base of the amendments project, is this standard, which was issued in August of last year or last summer, which took officially 5 years to generate, but it took about 10 years for the whole project to come to fruition. And I'll show you a slide about that. So the scope is basic safety, which is 95%, well, probably 98% of the standard, and essential performance, which is your clinical function that's a royal pain in the ass to deal with. Excuse my great language. Of medical electrical equipment. So if you're not an electrical piece of equipment and you're outside of, if you're an active implantable, you're excluded. If you're an infusion, in vitro diagnostic equipment, you're excluded. And if you're a medical gas supply, you're excluded out of the standard. Sounding like an East Coaster again.
But there's, I imagine, a different set of numbers that applies to them.
Yes. 14708 for ISO for active implantable. IVD is IEC 61010-1. And I can see Joe's eyes starting to roll.
I'm just thinking there's no one in this organization that has taken a basic marketing class.
Why should they? That's what you're for.
Right. It's just hard to know. It's hard for the rest of the world to know, to associate these numbers with meaning, but please continue.
Well, that's why people hire me, is to know what standards apply to their devices. That's one of the many things we do. And medical electrical systems, which is a combination of more than one product put together. So I'm not going to get into the basics of the standard, but if you want to know more, you can go to these links, which will be in a copy of my presentation.
Okay.
So the amendments project is a combination of all these standards up here, plus this one that I forgot about. Because when I was dealing with the amendments project, because I was on several of the committees for 60601-1, or I call it 601 for short, electromedical equipment standard, which is under a certain committee, which this is that one committee is SC62A. This is under 62B, which is a different committee that deals with X-ray and other equipment. So this is X-ray equipment. This one's electromedical disturbances. It used to be called EMC. So that's 1-2. And these are the collaterals here. And 1-3 is another collateral. Usability engineering, I forget the rest of the title, is 1-6. See, I don't know everything, Joe. 1-8 is alarms, alarm systems. 1-9, environmentally conscious design. Hardly anyone uses it anymore. Brazil's one of the only countries really that uses it. And Joe's actually watching. I'm surprised. There's only a couple clauses that really apply in Brazil through Anvisa. And then this one is the physiologic closed loop controls standard 1-10, which applies when you have some other particular standards that apply typically. Home healthcare environment, not home use environment, so that's a typo on my part. I point out my mistakes. I'm not perfect. And I'm on that committee as well, and I'm also on this committee as well. Like Joe says, I am on a lot of committees. I am an exception, Luke. I'm not one of those big companies. I'm a one-person company and I'm on a lot of committees.
How does
But
that happen? Does your
I
reputation
pay,
precede you and somebody,
no, the
reaches out to
reason
you or?
is well, there's two reasons. The first reason is there were 4 companies that approached me about 15 years ago and asked to write a standard so they could get into Japan. And I said, I've never written a standard, but I know the people on the committees. I can ask one of them that was the head of SC62D, which is particular standards or a good chunk of them. And he was very gracious to help teach me some of the bits and pieces of the process, the internal side, which is a royal pain in the butt, put it nicely. And so I learned a lot through the process. And because of that, I decided to also join all these committees, which I had to do on my own. I had to pay yearly fees through ANSI and through Amy, join the committees, and I have to pay my own travel, hotel, all these extra fees. It's a lot of money every year. It really adds up.
You pay for the privilege of being on a committee?
Oh, yes, very much so. I pay ANSI fees, I pay Amy fees every year.
Is it because you just love it and you want to contribute and it's your passion, or is
Well,
there
it's
a
for that.
business reason that like, oh,
There-
you're on that committee, then I need to hire you? Is it a credibility thing?
It's a credibility thing, most definitely. Because now I also know the background and the understanding. I'm also writing some of the requirements for the standard. We're trying to change things to make it better. But it's an incredibly slow process. I mean, third edition amendment 2, from when I know things started, and I know it started before really when things really started, was a 10-year process, which is arcanely slow. Technology moves so much faster than that,
Mhm.
as Luke mentioned in his presentation. I mean, I'll show a timeline on the next slide. I'm not going to go through, sorry about that, about all these reasons because we're already way behind where I'm on my schedule. So this was the official timeline of the project. And you can see it started officially at the end of 2016. It was supposed to publish late in 2019, and actually most of the standards published in the summer of 2020, except for one. And this is a lot of the details, which I'm not going to bore you with. But the one thing I will comment, just out of humor, is a lot of the old timers called IEC, which the standard and the series in general is through IEC, except for some of the particulars. The old timers call it International Eating Committee because we travel around the world, and almost every night we go out and have sometimes crazy meals and go out and eat for hours and hours and drink like crazy. Some of the old timers
Think like crazy, okay?
Well, some of the old timers, some of the newer, younger guys, which there's very few, the committees are graying like crazy. They need new blood. There's not enough new blood in these committees. So if anyone's interested in new blood and has the money to support it, or the companies, go join the committees. That's a plug. There's
Ty, is
really
that
not
interesting for you? Leave me a note if that's interesting for you, Ty. Not that you have a lot of time supporting Michelle, but still, go on.
Yeah, Michelle would love that. Is Michelle on the call?
No, Ty is her chosen representative today. Ty, you want to chime in? I'll bring your voice back on anyhow. Okay, please continue.
Okay, so this is, yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say I'll show the face now that I'm not walking around my house. But yeah, I mean that would probably be something that Michelle would be interested in, and it's
For
definitely
herself or for you?
We'll see. I mean, both of us, but it's definitely interesting to see, and it's a problem when there's no new perspectives or people to continue these processes on that have been working with industry and startups that know the challenges of going through these kinds of regulations. So it's definitely interesting to hear that the committees are looking for new people.
And Leo, I think you're looking at the comments here that Keith is asking, how do you join one?
It depends on the country.
So
So-
Keith, go ahead and type a little bit about yourself, maybe your LinkedIn link, and I'll take a look while you're presenting.
Oh, and Keith is in, I know Keith
Oh, okay.
personally.
Where is
So
he and what does he do?
He's in Ireland, right? Keith, I believe. I used to work with him through NSAI, but he left and decided to go back to industry. He was smart. He left NSAI.
Mm-hmm.
It was the smart one. I still do work for NSAI on the side. We had a good time together.
Yes, he is in Ireland. He's working for Becton Dickinson.
Yep. We know each other.
And Jan puts in a plug for anyone who wants to join a packaging committee. She might be able to help you get on that if you're interested. ASTM or ISO. Okay.
Okay. Moving along slowly here. So, and I really haven't gotten much into the amendments project yet. So the structure of the series is here's the general standard or base standard. I call it mothership because it has so many pages and so much information. Everything's leveraged off the general standard. Here's all the collaterals that come along horizontally. And they, in general, apply to a lot of medical electrical equipment. And I've already told you the names, so I'm not going to repeat them. Then there's some guidance documents here. Now, FDA does a little trick. They call this one a recognized consensus standard. And it, even though recognized consensus standards are officially voluntary by the FDA, if you don't follow recognized consensus standards, you have a hard hill to climb. So I recommend those that need EMC, which is all medical electrical equipment, follow this. And they reference several EMC and wireless guidance documents. I just looked it up this morning to double check that my head was screwed on right, and it is, amazingly. Then there's this document, which is basically the interpretations that the test labs who run most of this committee, the interpretation group, which is working group 14, which I've happened to snake my way onto. And like Luke has said, a lot of the test labs, which also are the notified bodies for Europe in a lot of cases, have a lot of control on these committees and also the big companies in general, because they're the ones that have the money, right? So I'm one of the very few sort of independent type people on this committee. So the interpretations that have existed over time, some of those have fed into the updates to the standard for the amendments project. So that was the key point here. The other part of the structure are the particular standards, which I have another slide on. But 2-2 has been around a long time. It's on its 6th edition, and that is the high frequency surgical equipment. So these are particular technologies here, or a vertical standard. And so this, I went onto the back end of the website for IEC, where committee chairs and conveners and working group members have access to, not the general public. And I pulled down part of the 62D links for the standards. And this is a partial list of these part 2s or particulars. So a couple I just wanted to highlight, and these are already 2 years old now. Robotically assisted surgical equipment, medical robots for rehab, assessment, compensation, alleviation. And the last 2 here are brand new. They came out this year. Cerebral tissue oximeter equipment, high frequency ventilators, just came out this year. These are ISO standards because they were led by the ISO committee. Even though it's an IEC ISO group, it's an 80601 because it's joint committee IEC and ISO together. But my committee, wherever it is, up here, IEC 80601-258, lens removal, lens vitrectomy equipment. So I was approached by eye care companies to write that standard, and we're actively working on the standard right now to go on to the 3rd edition. It's all of,
a couple years,
Sorry.
probably 4 or 5 years ago.
I couldn't understand the question, or was that a question?
It wasn't. Please continue.
Oh, okay, sorry. What? So these are the dates of when all the amendments, so all the general standard and all the collaterals were published. So you have those dates if you need them. Like I said, the X-ray standard published later than everything else, just because they're a different committee, they run on their timeline, I guess. These are the standards that had major changes, significant changes. This one, the usability standard just had definitions, and the standards, the reference standards like the collaterals and whatever other standards they referenced, updated. No technical changes, but there were some changes here. And this one, the home healthcare environment one, there were minor changes, but there were definitely a couple technical changes in it. I don't know that I'm going to have time to talk about it though today.
And we'll let the audience guide us with questions that are of particular interest.
Okay.
But at the moment, there's nothing. Go on.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
So we've talked about sort of in general that the general standard and the collaterals, sort of the top layer of stuff, has been updated. Now we have to deal with all those particulars, which there's probably about 65 now. I haven't counted lately to know the exact number. And in 62D, which I am the US co-chair for that committee, yes, another committee, Joe.
How many committees are we up to?
I have no freaking idea. I'd have to look at my CV and I just don't have time.
Let me talk with your wife after this call.
Yeah, good luck. She's busier than me. She's getting so many grants right now. She even got one from Google last week.
Okay.
Which is fantastic. She's saving the world, so I can't complain. She's working with saving endangered butterflies, so she's doing good work.
It is important work.
It is. It is.
We have a question from Haley, who's a relatively new member, who writes, I made it. And this is her first call because she needed to hear about 60601. She wants to know the highlights to the home health changes.
Okay, we'll try to get to those slides.
Okay.
Or you'll have to wait till we get there. Depends on how you guys guide me, I guess. So particular standards have to follow all the changes after the general and collaterals changed. So the plan is basically that it's going to take 3 years from when all that stuff ended. And we started that probably officially in March or April. And we have a 3-year clock that we have to get it done by then. So if you have, say, a multifunction parameter monitor, you're going to have several particular standards. You might have SpO2, you might have a blood pressure cuff, and maybe EKG. That's at least 3 particular standards. Then you'll have the general standard, the ENC standard, the usability standard, and the alarm standard at a minimum. And then you might even have home healthcare. So that's 3 plus 5, you probably have 8 standards. That's going to be complex to manage. And will all the amendments get done? I mean, particulars get done at once? Definitely not. 2-2, the high frequency surgical one's probably going to get done quicker than a lot because I know who's running that committee and he runs roughshod over that committee. And he's one of the higher level people within a lot of these committees. I'm a low level person in relative terms. I'm involved in a lot of stuff, but I don't have seniority by any stretch of the mind in a lot of these committees. So yes, you've seen this diagram, but not with some of this colored stuff here. And see, I even appeal to the regulatory folks in this one. I'm a regulatory folk too. Maybe not to the level of the Rob Packards and the Michelles and the Allison Kumiyamas of the world. I'm not quite at that level. I don't do the submission side of the world. But when there's AI letters from FDA and there's questions about 601, people come running to us. So I support that. And also I deal with notified body submissions for putting tech files together or tech documentation now. Also, I'm a product reviewer, so I do have a regulatory perspective. So the 601 series has life cycle standards embedded in the standard. And I'm not reading the questions because I'm too busy.
That's okay. I'm your question guide. Please continue.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So there's three basic ones of primary importance. There are other references throughout the standard, but these are the biggies. And these are the life cycle standards that are involved in it that are all medical based. 14971, risk management. We've gone from second edition in Amendment 1 of 601 to Amendment 2, and this is my coding, A1 and A2 throughout the rest of the presentation. You won't see Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 written out. I'm lazy. And I'll make it easier for everyone, hopefully. So that's risk management. Then 62304, first edition in Amendment 1. Now it's edition 1.1. I wish it was second edition, but second edition of 62304, which is software lifecycle process. So that's this one here. And I'll explain this stuff in a minute. This standard has been struggling for probably close to 10 years to get to second edition. It I think it was 2014, had a failed committee draft vote that failed. And this year, either it's failed or is about to fail another committee draft vote, which was a third round committee draft vote, which is ridiculous to go that many times around in circles. But there's arguments within the committee, which is a joint committee. It's ISO and IEC, and it's a very big committee, much bigger than most committees. And there's a lot of contention about risk management within 62304 because of the 82304 standard. And now Joe's eyes are rolling over and over and over again with all these numbers going through it. Then there's usability. So 62366-1, the newer version of the standard versus the older, totally different standard, well, not totally different standard, but a distinctly different standard from 62366 without the -1. So these are separate standards, not just different editions or versions, but actually different standards. So the notation down here in brackets will tell you what standards in the series of 601 standards up here reference normatively, meaning required, not informative, being not required, but guidance, 14971. So risk management is throughout a lot of the series of these standards up here that we dealt with in the amendments project. So the general standard, the EMC standard, the usability standard, and the physiologic closed loop standard. I'm surprised it's not in this one actually, but I guess it isn't. 62304 is in PEMS, which is Programmable Electromedical Systems, clause 14. This used to be a separate standard in second edition of 601-1. And we moved it into clause 14. So that was when we went from second edition of 601-1 to third edition, then 3.1 and now 3.2. And then for 62366-1, it starts in usability, not in 601-1. So in 601-1, we found when we were doing all our edits and changes that we misrepresented this standard as a normative reference by mistake. And it shouldn't have been in third edition amendment 1. So we moved it as to a bibliography reference. So it's informative, that's a nit, but it's what it is. And now the normative reference starts out of the usability standard. This is a bridge to usability because all of these standards here are full life cycle standards. All of these standards are type test standards. So we exclude production and post-production from these standards. All the green standards do not include the full life cycle. It's only type test, meaning we're only testing once officially. You might retest a little bit to get a passing result, but you're not going through the full life cycle of the product, where you are in usability, and risk management, and software lifecycle process, which is a big distinction that some people miss. I won't say the standards like usability and 601 are perfectly written that way, but that's the intent. Okay, now for the changes, or some of the changes, and I had to cut a lot out because we don't have the time to cover everything. So normative references means what are the required standards. I'm only looking at a little segment. There's about 60 or 70 normative reference standards in 60601-1. So here are the updates and new references. So the collaterals, which are these four, that's not the whole set of collaterals, but in 60601-1, third edition amendment 2, there's these four, and these are the new dated references, but it's the whole standard with, so this is, what is this? This is fourth edition plus amendment 1. That's the one I know what edition is. These I couldn't tell you what edition without looking it up. I don't memorize everything. There's way too much to memorize. These three are brand new standard references within the 601 third edition amendment 2 or amendment 2. So
can you give us perhaps for these three new ones a sentence? What you need to know about the first one is what?
So opto-isolators are a device that isolates from one side of a circuit to another side of a circuit. And it got added into the standard because there were no requirements in the standard about it. And now we put them in writing, but the test houses have always asked for those requirements. So now we have those requirements there, which is great. That's really good. The other thing I wanted to note is about the date here. So this is an old standard, and we said or later. The or later means if there's a new version out there, you would meet the new version. And if a newer version gets put out, then you would meet the newer version.
Okay.
But you still have the option, how it's written, you can use this old dated version, which is sort of nice. How that's written. This one's written, and it's not written saying undated reference. That's me pointing it out. So this is for lithium batteries, which are rechargeable. So lithium batteries have been in the standard before, but this is a newer version of the standard. There's two versions in the standard now. And before it was just 62133 as the reference. Now there's 62133 and 62133-2. So there's two versions. There's the old version of the standard and this newer version of the standard. So we've given you an option in the standard which version to use. If you use this version, actually the older version too, they're both undated. Undated references mean you have to use the latest published version of the standard.
I added Jan because she wrote, each standard may cost up to $150 normally. And
or more, or a lot more than that. As Luke has mentioned, Estonia is an excellent resource, as Luke mentioned in his presentation. And I can, Luke or I can send that link. Estonia standards. You want to make sure to get 2 copies, not 1. Otherwise, you get a locked version that you only can print like once or twice or something, and you can't share it and blah, blah, blah. The only way to make it usable is to get 2 copies of it. It's still much cheaper than any other resource. Other thing I do is sometimes go through Amy and I get the standards database. As a member, it's still about $1,500 a year. But for me, as an active user, I use a lot of standards. I live standards. That's a lot of my life. Here I say it. It's still worth it. For other people, it may not be. But for most companies that have medical devices, it has biocompatibility standards. It's not a complete database like, what was it, BSI's Navigator program, but their program's really pricey, as I think Michelle mentioned in Luke's presentation. And I don't know the pricing of it. I've written for Compliance Navigator a few times years ago.
You've mentioned it enough, and there are a number of people who may not have had it. So in the chat, I just sent a link to Luke's presentation called 10 Really Bad Things About 60601. And you're welcome to watch that later on.
It's a good presentation.
If you'd like, I can also call it up and go to the final slide that shows what all 10 of them are, if that would be a helpful reference for you to discuss.
I don't remember what they are. I didn't look at the end. I just refreshed a little bit this morning because it's been a while since I saw them.
I'm gonna call it. I have a moment of sound here, so let me quickly shut that. Okay, we're good.
Okay. The last one that changed is 62368-1, and I have several slides on that, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But it's a additional information technology equipment, basically standard that the 601 standard deals with, and I'll get into that in detail. So I'm not going to belabor it right now, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the scope of any standard, and Dan, I think you probably could agree with this, is critical to know if it applies or not to your product. Not that always the regulators agree, because sometimes regulators will push you into a standard even if you don't agree with them. And I've seen it over and over again, especially in the 23 years of consulting. I've sort of laughed at some of what regulators say the product is versus, because like now FDA is saying for IVD equipment, B and C standards that need to apply is 60601-1-2, the EMC for medical electrical equipment, which is not the standard that the scope would say. Totally not. There are IVD EMC standards, but FDA is not agreeing with that. Period. The end. That's an excellent example, but neither here nor there. But I always go to the scope and I read it and try to understand, does my product fit in this scope of standard? And when you look at a scope, even, well, ISO makes it hard because you can't tell a definition from any other word because they're all in small letters like this. There's no small caps. IEC, at least in the 601 series, has small cap letters for defined terms. In third edition amendment 1, there's 147 definitions. Drive you nuts. Well, in third edition amendment 2, we made it worse. There's 154.
You can also read the scope on the ISO website, so you
Yeah,
don't
but
have
the
to buy the whole
definitions
standard.
are not there. You don't get access to the definitions.
Right,
on
but you
ISO
can at
or
least read the
IEC.
scope.
That is true, but
And that
don't
helps.
you don't have those definitions. The scope is helpful, but there are always those defined terms buried in the scope. So there's the balance. If you know the definitions, you're great. If you don't, you might be at a disadvantage, is all I'm saying.
How come you don't have these definitions in their own separate document like normally is done?
So actually for 601 in the 4th edition, that's part of our architectural structure that we have a committee working on that to get into what's called the Electropedia, which will be published on the IEC website. But we're talking several thousand definitions between all the particular standards and the general standard and the collaterals. So there's a committee working on it right now, but it's probably going to be years before it's published. Best they can do. We work at a snail's pace because it's all volunteers that are doing it on top of their regular jobs. What's Rick want? He's got quite a triad there. So quick note about terms and definitions. So risk management, because we went from the 2007 version of the standard to the 2019 version of 14971, some people are going, oh no, we have lots of changes, right? Well, the changes weren't really that bad. Yeah, some of the words, harm, hazard, and hazardous situation in 14971 changed. So all those references reference back to 2019, and some of the definitions are a little different. But the base of 601 standard really didn't change. So the risk management process itself, there was no significant change. This is where I thought Luke's presentation and my comments about 601 line up really well. So essential performance is the clinical function of your device and basically the limits in single fault and normal condition. And it's not all your clinical functions. I highly recommend not saying it's all your clinical functions. It's one or two. Keep it simple. Otherwise, you're going to test forever and it's going to be a nightmare. Keep it as simple as possible, but do the most critical ones. There was no changes to essential performance. Essential performance is written miserably. It is one of the worst clauses in the standard. It's the most confusing aspect of the standard. People have spun in circles. When third edition came out, I didn't understand it. It took me quite a while to understand it. It took test houses years and years and years to really understand it well. And I'd say only recently, and third edition came out in 2005. FDA's been bashing test reports, and not just test houses, but manufacturers, asking, where's your essential performance analysis? Saying why you said there's no essential performance. Because there's test reports still since 2005, 2012 is Amendment 1, saying there's no essential performance for my product. FDA will claim most products have essential performance. Many of us will say, well, hold your horses. That may not be the case in every single product. There's a few that shouldn't have essential performance because there's really probably no clinical function. Most products have clinical function if it's a medical product, truly. So there's some essential performance, but it's maybe on the very, very edge that it's not much. So it's become a big issue, especially around FDA. So I've written an SOP years and years ago to help my clients with this. It's really funny that the interpretation sheet that came out, I don't know, 3-6 months ago, sort of mirrors my SOP. And I didn't give a ton of support. I made a lot of comments about it, sort of on the later end, about the development of the interpretation sheet. So this links to my blog, which has a copy of the interpretation sheet. I'm not sure if it links to the IEC website or if it's a copy. I can't remember because it's been a while since I posted the blog. But you're welcome to a copy of it. If it's on the IEC website, you might have to set up an account to get a free copy, is the worst case. But I highly recommend it because it's written so much better than how 4.3 is written. And the whole standard's written in a very complex, interlaced way that makes life difficult to read the standard. I admit that very freely and clearly, because the standard points like this. It's never just clear and straight. Well, there are a few areas that are, but there's many areas that point all over the place. So talking about FDA, which I talk to the standards and conformity assessment group on a pretty regular basis. And this group that set up the pilot program for the ASCA program, the Accreditation Scheme for Conformity Assessment, is in that group. I was on their panel, I think it was about 3 years ago, talking about that ASCA program. And I actually did some internal training for FDA on essential performance prior to this, and during the panel, I should say. And they had me talk for, I think it was like a whole 15 minutes because there was such a big panel on essential performance. And that's a bugaboo for them. So they've been training the test labs or having workshops with the test labs now. And essential performance has been a big issue with them. So one of the goals of the program for FDA is to have better communication with test labs, which they never had prior to this pilot program. So one of the goals is to have a direct link with the test labs, a direct link with the accreditation bodies which are accrediting the test labs, and a direct link with the manufacturers, which they've had before. But now this means that the device manufacturers have communication with test labs, the accreditation bodies have a communication link with test labs and with FDA. So they've sort of made this new network of communication that makes life easier for the FDA to have direct feedback with test labs. And hopefully that will improve the information they're getting from the test labs, which hopefully will improve the quality of the information in the reports they get from the test labs, which would be a big deal. So here are the three guidance documents out of the program. The general guidance document, the one that's for the 60601 standards, and the 61010-1 standard, which is the base standard, not the IVD lab equipment standard, the 61010-2-101. It's not that one. It's just the general standard. My standard, the 2-58, was not in the original program. It got recognized after the publication of this guidance. And Scott, the head of the FDA program, actually sent me a personal note when the standard got recognized. And then I went on the website and looked, and the ASCII program added my standard in automatically, which I thought was pretty cool. So as standards are getting recognized, if they're mentioned within these guidances, it may get added into the ASCII program, which I thought was sort of nice that they're being smart about it. It was a little surprising to me.
I'm going to mention that I just put Luke's presentation, which you've liberally mentioned, in the chat box, a link for MDG Premium members. You can just download it now. And you may be wondering, why did I put Rick on the screen? He's handsome and he had something to say. So Rick, you want to share your message by unmuting yourself?
Go for it, my senior.
Well, let's see. I'm not a 60601 guy, and I also don't come in at the beginning of a project. Very often, it'll be after the first.
Neither do I. Most people
funding.
come to me like years way too late is the problem.
Okay, that's exactly the center of the question. So what I'm looking for is I assist with the design. We've got people all over this network who assist with all kinds of things. And what are some indications that I might need to advise development?
You broke up, Rick.
Oh, I noticed you were breaking up too. Let me do that. Let me try it again real quick. What are some indications that I need to advise my client to contact you?
They're breathing.
That may not be specific enough for the guys I work for.
All right, go ahead.
I'll give you an example. Sometimes I'll be in the middle of something and they'll say, we want to have a new type of user interface in the device. And I'll look at that significantly changed it. And sometimes I'll say, well, what are the regulatory ramifications of what you're doing? Or have you checked this out? And sometimes I'll get an answer like, well, regulatory what? No, they're not that ignorant. But sometimes it's not clear. So I'm just trying to absorb from your point of view, what are some of the things that might trigger me to advise them to get with you?
So are electrical components changing? Sometimes mechanical interfaces could be, because this standard's a lot more than just electrical. There's mechanical issues, there's electrical issues, there's labeling issues, there's alarm indicator issues. So lights are changing. It could be nods, values, packaging. Sometimes if
Here's a business development idea for you both. And it's a function of, Leo, are you comfortable giving half-hour free consultations to folks?
I do. It's on my website.
Okay. So Rick, you might simply ask anytime something electrical comes up, and Leo, help me with the noun and the adjective. Have you ever spoken with a blank blank about this? An electrical engineer, a 60601 safety specialist? The answer will probably be no, and say, my friend Leo routinely talks with my clients, and he'd be happy to give you a half hour to just make sure you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's. Would you like that free resource? And everyone will say yes. And then
also have a form in my website that they can fill in.
Nobody wants a form. Just say,
oh,
I know a guy.
Feedback on the form lately. It's pretty active. That form is pretty active, actually. Amazing.
Okay.
When I've talked about Leo in the past, Leo, when I've talked about you in the past, the level of interest goes up when I mention that you're on a lot of these committees that are drafting these things, that you're that much in the system, and you're not just an outside observer. which is kind of an
Credibility
interesting
building,
thing
just as you
about
said
you.
before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
does.
Thank you,
That
Rick.
adds credibility.
I have to jump off onto an 11 o'clock.
All right.
But thanks
Oh,
for squeezing in
9
the
o'clock
question.
here. What are you talking about, Rick?
Thank you, Rick.
Little thing called Central Daylight Time. Well, what can I say?
Yeah, I know.
Texas.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to
See
step
you next
back
week.
for a second.
Catch you
Get
later.
on here. Good seeing you, Rick. You take care. I'll be right back.
This is the part of the play where the understudy sits here and smiles at the audience.
It's just getting hot in the office.
Okay.
How hot is it up by you, Joe, today?
It's
Is
cool
it
today.
up to 100?
No,
Well,
we're
you're
not.
only a 3-hour drive from me.
You
we're
should
gonna
be up
have-
here more often.
I guess. You
Can
are
you,
in
for our guests, just to manage the time, we routinely go over an hour, and people who drop off just drop off at the hour, and they can watch the replay later. But how much more do you have by way of slides that you wanted to cover?
I'm about
Halfway
halfway
through.
through
Yeah.
since I keep getting interrupted, but that's fine. And I will have to drop off in about an hour.
Oh, well, an hour, 120 minutes of this is more than I think my system can handle. I might have an electrical issue of short circuiting and need a defibrillator. So
Let's hope not.
yeah, from a safety perspective, let's go on for another 20 or so.
Okay, well, I'll try to blast them.
Okay.
So I'm going to skip the rest of that slide. If it will do. So
And the slides will be made available, folks, on premium. And yeah, hit us with the highlights. You can even hit the highlights when you hit this one. This is what you look for, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Watch it as a
so a
companion to your
big
slide
deal
deck.
is that, so this link is all the labs that are accredited. So there's 68 as of yesterday. The big deal is last week, the first biocompatibility lab got accredited. And the difference is that most biocompatibility labs only haven't had 17025 ISO standard, where safety labs have. There are some safety labs that are manufacturers, like Philips is on there and 3M is on there yesterday. The highlights on this slide that are really important, this is probably the most critical one, is if you're doing the program as a manufacturer and you go to a lab like Element or Intertech or whoever, you need to make sure the standards for that lab are on the program for that lab. And when you get your summary test report, you want to look at the modifications, concerns, observations, and degradations, and nothing bad's in there. Because if you send that into FDA and there's something bad, you're going to get an AI letter back saying, hey, wait a second, because they're not going to be looking at the test reports anymore. They're going to be looking at the summary test report, which is maybe 5 or 10 or 15 pages versus, hundreds and hundreds of pages that used to be in the CB scheme test reports that you were getting from the test labs. They're not going to be looking at that anymore. They're relying on the test lab's summary test report, which is what the pilot ASTA program is all about, primarily.
Okay.
So this slide, these are added definitions that already existed in other standards, so it's not a big deal, period. Really isn't. They've already existed, nothing new, nothing significant. These are the only two new definitions added. Maximum equipment pressure deals with pressure vessels. There's very few products out there that have pressure vessels, so it doesn't affect many people. Safety sign, it wasn't a defined term previously. Safety signs, the next slide actually has a safety sign, so I can explain it that way. It used to be that it was an undefined term throughout the whole standard. It was all over the place, scattered, and now it's a defined term. That's really the difference. So this symbol was sort of almost in a sense unofficially mandated and forced on manufacturers to use as read IFU instead of being a primary risk mitigator. If you're using the symbol for a primary risk control measure, then you should be using it, which is the clarification in Amendment 2, where now in Amendment 2, if you're not using it as a risk control measure, then you're allowed to use this guy here.
Luke writes, the problem with that symbol is it has to be a certain type of glue. And I would say the problem with the symbol is, I don't know what the hell it means without the context you just gave. It looks like a guy reading a book.
Thank you. You made my point, or one of my points. I have lots of points. I hate that freaking symbol. For one,
We've gotten him worked up, folks.
Oh, you don't even know.
You don't want to piss off a 60601 consultant with ambiguous symbols.
Well, I don't like labeling and symbols in general because they're horrible mitigators. I want you to design into your product your risk mitigators because that's the best way to design a product. But labeling is sort of worthless.
Okay, I'm going to keep you focused. Moving on.
Okay, so this is your goal to avoid this. And A2 gives you that option that you can use this a lot more liberally, unless you do this as risk control, which I highly recommend you avoid doing. And if you have, I'm going to say one other point real quick on this one. If you have a tie back pouch, this is really hard to do because you're in black and white usually. And I've had arguments over that issue. So this is a big change in the standard, and I recommend anyone that falls under 601 or is pushed into 601 really do a big gap assessment against their products against this table, because it's really the LORM standard committee put a huge amount of work into it, but that's not the reason to look at it. It's because it's basically forcing anyone that has any lights or indicators and audio, because there's this accompanying sound column and then the indicator light sound, column for flashing lights and indicator lights. So there's risk management sort of buried in here and reference to 60601-8 in multiple places in the footnotes. So it ties you to the risk management aspect of 60601-8. So this, as Luke also mentioned, risk management is embedded in 60601-1. So this is a huge gap assessment that almost every medical electrical device really is going to have to go through, from A1, which was tiny and almost irrelevant how it was written, to now what A2 is. Oops, wrong direction. So this figure used to be in the back of the standard, so it was considered guidance. Now it is normative, so it is required. The big issue with this this decision tree is it's for means of protection, between means of patient protection, which is basically what touches the patient, and means of operator protection, which is everything else. So it could be the user, the clinician, the doctor, the nurse, well, not the janitor. That would be, but it could be a user. It could be a technician too, is a user. But also, in some cases, a patient is a user. In a home healthcare environment, a patient can be a user if they're charging the device and it's not attached to it. But I'm drifting a little bit. And Joe says, keep it moving. So in the decision tree, if you're down here, you have three options for operator protection. You have used the standards for 60950, which is information technology equipment. That existed in 3rd edition 3.1 and now still also 3.2, but we updated the standard. And this new standard 62368-1, which got forced into the standard late in the development process. I'll mention in a minute on the next slide. So that got updated. That's why this box is red. The other option is within the 601 standard to use the tables, and all this is for separation of parts means creepage and clearance, which is spacings, so separation, and insulation, which means dielectric or hypon testing. So these are means of operator protection within the 601 standard. This is using external standards. Or if you really want, and these are all manufacturer's choice, I think is the words, or you could use means of patient protection, which is also within 601 standards. So these are different tables.
I'm going to interject here that my main takeaway, as has been the case basically every time you speak, is ask Leo. It has to do with safety. It has to do with electricity. Ask him, because you're not going to know this stuff as well as he. And why are you going down this rabbit hole when this man has frittered away his life in this domain? So just,
There are
yeah, break.
engineers
He
that
spends so much
know
time.
this as well as I do. There are engineers that do know this stuff, some. And then there are people that know.
And there's the rest of the world, which is, I know a guy. And folks, I'll remind you from a marketing perspective, that's the point of any presentation, really. I mean, yes, I could tell you marketing ideas and go ahead and build your own website. Or you'd be like, I'm not going to do that. Just get the guy who does that. He's the guy who does that. So with that in mind, I'm going to challenge you to give us a sentence about each of the remaining slides. And as you do that, I'm going to ask the folks who are still on the call, if you've had any really exasperating experiences with a client as it relates to safety, perhaps an outstanding issue, perhaps something that is still like, oh, every day I have to deal with this, to give us less informed folks an idea of the kinds of challenges that you routinely face. One sentence per slide, go.
One sentence, wow.
That's a sentence right there. Now you got to move on.
You were challenging today.
Okay, that's another sentence. You are, come on.
Negative. Okay. So I know that's 4 sentences. I'm like negative. So the old standard 60950 basically disappeared last year. And
Okay.
62368-1, third edition, became state of the art. And so a team got formed and we basically found that it was not equivalent. And so we had to somehow shove it in, and it basically exploded section 8 of the standard, which is electrical hazards.
Run-on sentence. Next slide.
Yes, it was run on, but I got the point.
You put a lot of ands.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, conjunctions are a workaround. And now see if you can do it without a conjunction.
Holy crud, you are tough.
Go on, go on, go on.
So we talked about means of separation of parts. So in Amendment 1, we used to allow in 60950 2 means of operator protection equivalent to 1 means of patient protection. You're not going to be able to do that anymore because of the voltage level requirements going when you get higher than a certain voltage for 60950, and it's about half for 62368. So we recommend highly using 60601 power supplies -1 for 601 testing and 1-2 testing especially.
And for those, just in layman's terms, that is 2 moops do not always mean 1 mop. Please continue.
Very good, Joe. And I know you learned that from Luke.
I did.
Heard that one.
I did.
This one I actually was going to skip. Unless
right.
someone wants me to talk about it.
Well, what is it?
It's about accessible parts. So operator accessible parts. And we added an abnormal test at 1 second for operator accessible parts, which was not there in the standard, basically.
Next.
Was that quick enough?
It was good.
Thank you.
Hmm.
The title says it all. This was not an exhaustive list of changes for 60601-1.
Will the exhaustive list be worked on?
Last bullet.
Please continue.
That was my marketing tip.
Nice. Oh my, this is a new section you're starting.
1 slide.
All right.
And I will hit the big point.
Go on. A few sentences here.
No, it won't be a major run-on sentence. I'm going to cover 2 points. So in 4th edition Amendment 1, which FDA is really pushing really hard for people to follow at this point, even though this is also a recognized consensus standard, 4th edition, if you use it, you're going to be ahead of the game, because there's what's called this, where is it? The AIM standard, AIM 7351731. That standard, which is a recognized consensus standard as well, has about 6 or 8 frequencies that you need to test it, which they expect you to do. And it's in the new draft guidance for EMC. But if you follow 4th edition Amendment 1, and I've gotten written confirmation from the guy that was involved in writing 4th edition Amendment 1 from FDA, he says it's okay to use just 4th edition Amendment 1 and just doing these 2 frequencies, which is what's in 4th edition Amendment 1. So that's a bonus. You
Jan
save a
mentions
lot
how
of effort.
she handles this kind of thing. Jan, you want to take yourself off mute?
Oh yeah, I always like to either buy, which is hard to do with ISO standards, or make my own red line just so I can
There's a
see
CSV available, which is
what.
there's a CSV available, consolidated version is what it's called. They do make red lines sometimes, but what they've been doing lately is CSVs, which is consolidated version. The only problem with the CSV for Amendment 2, and I found this out the hard way, it took me a while to figure it out, and it's buried in, I think it's the forward, they say. It's a combination of A1 and A2, and they don't show you where the Amendment 1 changes are versus the Amendment 2 changes.
Yeah, that's a problem I find with most ISO documents. So I've learned how to jigger them so I can do that.
Well, I have a copy of the FDIS for Amendment 2, so I can place it against my Amendment 1, but that's no internal documents because I'm on the committees.
Well,
But not
FDIS
many
you can
people
buy, but
can't always
that's one of
recall
the
it.
main benefits for being on a standards committee is you can actually get a heads up ahead of time and understand everything
That is another advantage of being on the committee.
that's going
Just
on.
joining the
I'm on
committee.
several ISO committees and I'm US tag lead for another.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm on several committees just to get access to the copies and not be involved as well. And that's another advantage, is to be able to access those documents.
Thank you, Jan.
It's a very good point. Thank you, Dan. And the other frequencies, just if you have home healthcare environment products, you have one frequency to test out. The other thing is that risk management has changed significantly to be aware of that. That was it. Someone did ask about the home healthcare changes.
Yes, she
There
did.
are 2 of them. I only left 1 slide in. The other one is in the annex, and it's about water dripping on internal parts and getting basically battery powered equipment wet, or I think transformer wires wet. And you don't want to do that basically. So that's basically the gist of the other change. I don't remember the clause number. It's in clause 8 somewhere. And this is the other changes, these 2 bullet points. So the first bullet is basically saying that if you have an internal power source that you want, so this is a battery, and it is actually a battery, and you have this device, say, on your body, and I can't show it here, so I'll stand up. So say it's on your body, and you have it plugged into the wall. So I'm making this up. This is not reality. Say it's a diabetes monitor of some sort, and you have it plugged into the wall, and you have this battery on you, and you're charging it while it's plugged into the wall. You need to have 2 means of patient protection, which is a higher level than what's called, where is it? Oops, operator protection here. So it's safer because you have the highest level of protection away from what's called supply mains. Supply mains is what's plugged into the wall, is what supply mains means. Now down here, this is sort of a relaxation of the requirements, but this is sort of saying basically the patient becomes now the operator or the user of the equipment. And this is when you're putting, instead of having the product on you like here, you're putting it on your desk or your nightstand or whatever and charging this thing at night. And now the patient becomes the operator. And so you can relax the requirement for isolation or insulation, whatever you want to call it. And now it becomes operator protection. So it's a lower level of isolation requirements.
Okay.
And that's something that got written in specifically. So this was one of my other touts for the presentation, is what's coming down the line. Yes, we've already been thinking about this for years, even though we just got amendments out the door, but we haven't even finished the particular standards.
You might have noticed a moment or 2 ago, I started smiling broadly for no apparent reason. It's because Luke wrote a private comment here. He says, when Leo is finished, or you declare him finished, He has some questions for you because you're an insider. So soon I will be declarative, but it seems as though this is really what the people showed up for. So I don't know how many slides remain.
There's
But
like 3 left, maybe,
okay.
depending how you count it. So the earliest start, and this is a freaking pipe dream, is 2024. I think it's 2025, 2026, before the project for the next edition of the whole series starts. I don't think it's before 2025. And I doubt it, to be blunt. So some ideas they're looking at, there's an architecture document that's already in process. It's already at 3rd edition. So it's been beaten up several times over. Well, I think some of these things are pipe dreams, to be honest. One requirement shall statement per identifiable element. That would be amazing per bullet or subclause. If it gets to a subclause, that'd be incredible. A bullet, I think, is more realistic. I doubt we'll be able to get to one shall requirement just for a full subclause, right? Clear, less interlaced and complex requirements. That would be incredible for this standard. Use clear testable requirements. I'm sure Luke would agree, all 3 of these would be a huge leap forward. Integrate some of the collaterals into the 60601 general standard. So what that means is like the home health care and the the emergency medical services standard. Most definitely, those are planned to get rolled in. There's talk about the EM disturbances standard getting rolled in, and maybe some of the other ones as well. That would just make it a very big standard for one, because we're already at 400 pages. That makes it 600 pages or so. Just those 3 additional standards probably. But it would make the rest of the series a little less bulky, I guess. I'm not quite sure of the reasoning. I think it's because we're going to do more classification with the database system. So this idea sounds really nice, but right now I don't think IEC is able to support it because we've been testing the IEC software system, and currently IEC can't support this concept. A possible database standard where, say, like I said before, if you had a multifunction monitor device where you have 8 or so standards involved, you go, I have this type of device and I need this standard. Okay, I check all those off, and now the system goes and puts the requirements all together. Now you have a design spec per se that says, here's all your requirements, and it's actually put together that it's read as one document, which would be nice because having 8 or 10 separate documents is almost impossible to read because the particulars modify the collaterals and the general standard. And it gets really complex to read through that and make it make sense for even the seasoned people. So the unseasoned.
I'm going to gently guide you to the next point, please.
Yes.
And as you go there, Mencott wrote an excellent informative presentation, especially on FDA, ASCA to PEMS. PEMS.
Oh, PEMS. Okay. So what are the factors that may impact your decision when you transition to the amendments? Well, particular standards are going to affect you if you have any. When will national standards adopt the amendments? A really good question. The US is still behind the 8 ball. We failed our 2nd round of votes recently, like in the last couple of weeks. And I know that because I'm on these committees, or several of them. I'm not on all of them. I found out the other day. I sort of laughed at that. I thought I was on all of them. Yes, I know, but I'm reading a note because I had to cheat a little bit. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have the 601-1, the 1-2, the 1-8, 11, and 12. Those are the only ones the US is going to publish. The other ones we don't have control over in the US because we're not the ones that generated that standard or involved in generating. Of course, Europe, Senelec has approved for the European Standards Organizations, basically everything but the general standard. that one's like one stage behind from what I understand or what I can figure out. And some of the European standards organizations have already published some of them. And I'm not sure why 601-1's one stage behind. Transition dates of national certifiers such as UL, CSA, BSI, whatever other countries, I don't know what those transition dates are. I have no clue. I wish I knew, not even in the near future that I know of yet. National regulators. So as I mentioned, I do talk to the FDA group that deals with standards a lot. What they've told me is once these are approved by Amy, they will get it out the door as soon as they can. They are updating their database, which they're doing quicker than they publish in the Federal Register at least twice a year, but sometimes they're doing it quarterly. And the database gets updated without any notification. So you have to check the database on a pretty regular basis, I have found out. Because I get surprised on a quarterly basis easily. Sometimes I get little nice notes from them, so I'm pretty lucky about that. Oh, and they wanted to also update the particular standards, and I had to tell them you're going to have to wait a lot longer because those aren't getting updated for 2-3 years. So they were a little surprised about that. And then these points are basically, what are you going to do as a manufacturer? So what are your regulatory approvals? What's your regulatory strategy basically for your design, your safety certifications, your product strategy, your current products and your legacy products? And what's your business regulatory and quality system strategies and impacts? And this is the stuff I love dealing with because it's more fun than some of the boring stuff going through 601 too. So I like regulatory strategy. It's fun to deal with. So when will you start with the full gap assessment? The sooner, the better always. Looking at it doesn't mean you have to do it immediately, but thinking about it and regulatory strategy is always a good thing to do. Plan as far ahead as possible. 80-20 rule. These are the ways you can get a hold of me, and I do have a LinkedIn link right here. And like Joe said, I'll put it up on the Slack. Tell me which Slack.
I got you. Send it to me and I'll make sure it goes all the places it needs to go.
Okay, I'm a newbie within the group. Literally.
So treat him gently.
Yes, yes.
Treat him with safety gloves.
Ha, ha, ha.
See what I did there? Okay, Luke. For those of you who invariably will drop off at the 90-minute mark, I'm just going to have these two buddies chat a little bit, and I'll see you next week with Gunjan. He'll be talking to us about entering and thriving in the Indian market. Luke, what do you want to ask?
First, I have to owe him an apology because I called him in my presentation a part of the problem, and
Okay.
you obvious are not.
Well, I might agree with some of that comment, so don't worry about it.
As you're so deep into the system, right now, of course, the MDR is a big thing. And the 60601 is only harmonized against the old MDD.
Yeah, but it was a miserable mess. It took years, and there are additions behind in some of the particular standards because they never got harmonized.
You mean it's a mess at the EU? Because I can understand that.
Oh yes, and I made a comment on LinkedIn recently about that. I think it was LinkedIn, maybe it was Raps, that said, good luck for it to get harmonized under the MDR.
But who is leading in this? Is the European Union pushing towards Senelec to get all the MDR stuff into the 60601? Or is the IEC saying, right do what you like, but this is our standard and try to get it harmonized?
No, COSIR is pushing pretty hard. They're, a manufacturers organization, right, that represents manufacturers. So they're pretty involved in it, and they have been. And I know Philips is very heavy into representing COSIR for 601 and a lot of other things, obviously. So manufacturers are pretty heavy into pushing for it. I guess Joe's dropping off onto other things. So the problem that I know about is that there's only 2 past consultants.
I'm here, but I'm just letting you buddies talk. I'm not adding any value here.
Oh, that's okay.
All right.
No. So I know currently there's only 2 past consultants, and there was actually a request for past consultants recently. And I actually got a copy of that and I wrote in about it, and they said, oh yeah. So I said something, I asked about it. I said, well, you can't be involved in standards development. So I'm like, oh, well, then I'm not interested. It's like, who are you gonna get then? It's like, you gotta be kidding me. This is crazy. People that know how to evaluate the standards are people that are gonna be involved somehow.
So what is going to happen now then? The 60601 is not harmonized, but everybody keeps using it because there's no alternative.
That's state of the art, which is in Annex 1.
Yeah.
Both of the MDR and the MVD, which MVD is gone now because it's past May 26th.
Well, then another thing that's probably also appealing to Joe, that was the question: when do we ask someone like Leo Eisner to help us? And that's whenever you got an issue with your either test house or notified body because you disagree, and of course,
any regulator. So that's too late, though. It should be when you're starting your design.
Yeah, but even if you have your design and you know that you're right, and then you have this stubborn test house say it's not according to the standard. Like we contacted. Do you know Martin Schneeberg from Workgroup 14?
Oh, very well. I've known Martin for 27 years.
Okay, we had an issue with our test house, so we asked his opinion, and he agreed with us on a certain way. And then you can go to your test house. So do you know better than somebody who's on the work group or somebody who's on the technical committee? And then they just draw back and they let you do your thing. But only after you get someone on like you throw some weight in. If you say, I know that Leo Eisner agrees with us, then they have to be really strong in their shoes to disagree with you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is crazy. Yeah.
So I guess that's well, if you need advice, of course, you're really good. But if you really need someone with weight in if you have an argument, I guess you need someone like you.
Yeah, and I don't always have all the answers either. Sometimes I have to dig and figure it out myself.
Do you also advise on how you put it in words? Like we make devices that measure electricity on the outside of the body. So it's ECG, EMG, all that kind of stuff. But you can also measure on the head. So we say we can measure.
So you're not fully in the scope of a standard, but you're using that particular standard anyway.
No, because if you want to use that particular standard, you have some requirements on your input levels that you must support. And we don't support that. So they say you have an encephalograph. No, we don't, but you can measure brain signals. That's something different. Mm-hmm. So it took a really long discussion to get by that. And if we have someone like you who can agree, like we don't have an encephalograph, but it still measures brain signals, no big deal with that, then it's easier to get by the notified body. That you don't have to apply a standard. Instead of you do have to apply a standard. But it's in the wording,
basically, you're outside of the scope.
Yeah. So, yeah. But it's a way of how you define your product, I guess, in words.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely something we've done before.
Okay, thank you very much. I've been enjoying your presentation, so I'll just hop off.
Okay.
That makes us all.
Okay.
Leo, it's great having you in the network. And while most of this stuff went, well, actually, while all of it went through me, the main point is I know a guy. That's all I need. And that's what this whole network's about, knowing guys and gals who know stuff better than I do for easy referrals that I can feel confident putting my name behind. So thank you for that. And I'll see you all next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye for now.
Good seeing you, Joe. Take care.